Hey guys, this is Joseph from startdataengineering.com. In this video, I'd like to talk about data quality and how you can ensure data quality with a framework called Great Expectations. As always, if you want to follow this along in the blog format, I'll leave the link in the description below. Feel free to follow it there as well. So let's get started. So what is a data quality check? Data quality check is a check that is run after the data is loaded. This means, let's say you're loading in data into a staging table from your vendor or wherever. You want to test the data in the staging table to make sure it confines to the constraints that you have for that data. And some of the types of data checks would be basic data schema constraints. This is applicable if you're storing it in a file system such as AWS S3. You want to make sure it has the right number of columns in the right order, and the columns have the specified data type. There are also business specific constraints such as checking if a column has a specified set of values or if it falls within a range for continuous values, and also making sure that the table has a certain number of rows. An example of the last one would be, let's say you're loading in data from a third-party data vendor and you get on average 1,000 rows a day, and all of a sudden if you start getting 2 rows a day, that is something you definitely want to be alerted on. So why is data quality important? Obviously you're a data engineer and you want to make sure that the product you produce, which is your data, is good quality. But more importantly, it hugely impacts the decision making capabilities of your business. Let's say you're building a data warehouse and this data is going to be used by some business user to make some sort of marketing decision or advertisement decision, whatever it may be. If the data is not correct, the decisions are going to be false, or not correct, because the business users are making decision based on the incorrect data. So you want to avoid this. This is even worse if it's not a business user making the decision, but if it's a machine learning model utilizing the data you have produced. Let's say the machine learning model expects a field or a feature to be scaled, but your data does not have it scaled, and machine learning models don't have the intuition to understand that. It will just use your data. So if it just uses your data where it's expecting a scaled feature and you're sending it a unscaled feature, your predictions are going to be way off. This will potentially lead to loss of money, loss of user trust, and so on and so forth, loss of trust in you. So this is something you want to avoid. And the last thing you want to avoid is getting woken up by a slew of Slack messages. There are times when this is unavoidable. It may happen, but you want to reduce this and try to manage this as much as possible. So those are some of the reasons why data quality is important. So what is Great Expectations? Great Expectations is an open source data testing framework, data quality testing framework. And you can use it with popular databases such as MySQL, Postgres, Redshift, BigQuery, Snowflake, and also raw files such as AWS S3. And it can be scheduled using Airflow, it can be scheduled using Perfect, it can be scheduled using cron. You can even use it as a Python module, but only with pandas right now. Alright, so before we get started with the coding part, you will want to install Docker, PGCLI, and Great Expectations. You could just Google them, or you could go to my blog, again link in the description below, and the blog has the link to download these components. So let's go to the coding section of this. Hey guys, so assuming you have Docker, PGCLI, and Great Expectations installed, you can follow along. If not, please follow the links in the description below to install those components. So let's first check if we have any containers running. We don't have any containers running, so let's do docker run. Let's start a container called postgres local, and let's open up the port 5432 and make sure we set postgres user as SDE, start data engineer, and postgres password as password, and postgres database as data quality, and let's use the image postgres 12.2. That's right, this is D. Alright, so let's see, our postgres instance is running. We can use pgcli and specify localhost. Port would be 5432. User would be SDE, and I think it's database is -d, data quality. So let's connect to that. Password is password. Alright, so we are able to connect to this. So let's create, we see a schema called public, so let's now create a schema. Let's call it app create, and now let's create a table. This app dot you can call it order, which has order ID, which will be a varchar of 10, and let's say a customer ID of varchar of 10, and just to keep it simple, let's just call it status, and again this is a varchar of 10. So it's a pretty simple table, you know, with order ID, customer ID, status. And now we can insert some records into this table. So insert into app.order, what is this, order ID, customer ID, status. Let's say what values we want in there. Let's call it order 1. For simplicity, customer 1, and status will be, let's say, deliver, right? Alright, so similarly, let's insert 2 more, customer 2, order 2, in route, I guess. Another one would be order 3, customer 2, en route. So that's good for now. So we have a simple order. We have a very simple table with order ID, customer ID, and status, which has just unique IDs and order ID. Customer ID may be repeated, status will be delivered or en route. So let's quit Postgres. Now that we have the base set up, it's time to start initializing grade expectations. So assuming you have grade expectations set up, let's create a folder. Let's call it data quality. So data quality, so let's initialize grade expectations in it. And you could actually use this directory path to specify which directory you want to create grade expectations code repo in. So this will automatically start creating all those connections for you. Alright, so it's giving you a sample of the file structure that it is going to create, and let's ask if you want to proceed. Let's say yes. Would you want to configure a data source? This is the source which will be used to run the test. So we already have a source, which is our Postgres database. So let's say yes here. It's a relational database. Gonna move this around so you guys can see. Right now we are using Postgres, so let's select Postgres. Again, just to be consistent, let's name it data quality. It is localhost. So if you just press enter, it'll use these default values. What is the username? Username is SDE. Password is password, as we said during Docker run. And database name is data quality. So these are your credentials. It's going to be, or actually these are not your credentials. This is called your data source. Right, and the credentials will be under this folder. So would you like to proceed? Yes. Okay, so let's understand what expectation is, right? It is, you could consider an expectation to be made up of one or more test cases. So what that means is, if you want to ensure that in the app order table you just created, that the customer ID that we were using, customer 1 and customer 2, needs to fall within a specified set of customer IDs, that can be part of this expectations. But an expectation can also have many such test cases. So let's go ahead and say yes, we want to create an expectation. So it's asking us which one do you want to use. So right now we have only configured app.order, and that's why it's only asking, it's only prompting app.order. So let's just say one, and let's call it app.order.error to be dramatic. And it's saying like it's going to create a JSON file here. Let's say yes. You can also, so another thing with Great Expectations is that it builds data documentation for you. So if you go to this website that it will set up for you, it's actually static files, not a website. It's actually static files that it creates for you. You could see the type of data checks that are being run on the columns of that data source. So let's say yes. That's fine. It's creating that file. So you'll see it's a HTML file. You could just open it directly on your browser. That's building data docs. All right, let's view it. All right. So by default, it creates some like simple expectations, and how it creates this is it actually looks at the first 1,000 records of your table to create this. So let's take a look at this, right? So there's something called, let's show more. So here you see it'll only limit to the first 1,000 rows. So let's look at the table level expectation. It's saying by default must have between 2 and 3 rows, and this is because the number of records in our table was only 3 because we only inserted 3 records, and must have 3 columns, which is already customer ID status, and it's also making sure it is those specific 3 columns and nothing else. Like, and values must never be null. Values must be always more than 1 character long. So these are the specifications for order ID that it somehow created on its own. Don't worry, we will edit this to fit our needs. Alright, so it says Great Expectations is now set up. That's great. So let's see what the folder structure is, right? Great Expectation. The tree just shows you the folder structure. Alright, so let's take a look at this. You have checkpoints, you have expectations, you have notebooks, you have plugins, you have uncommitted. So uncommitted, let's start with the uncommitted one. Uncommitted basically has all the documentation and your configuration variable that you're not supposed to commit to the Git repos, because it contains credentials, and it may contain potential data information which you do not want to commit to your Git repo. So that's why it's called uncommitted. Plugins, you can add additional plugins. We will see that in a future tutorial, not for now. Notebooks, you can play around with Great Expectations using Jupyter Notebooks. Jupyter comes you get Jupyter when you install Great Expectations. So if you want to play around with some file, you can actually open that notebook, whichever one is appropriate, like Pandas or Spark or SQL, and you can play around with it, and you can test out these test functions there. We will take a look at that. And expectations, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, they actually are the core of this Great Expectations thing. It defines the test cases and puts it into something called an expectation. So you can have multiple expectations, and you can pick and choose which ones you want to run. So checkpoints are actually how you want to run these expectations. So you can create a checkpoint with one expectation, with two expectations up to n expectations, and when you run that checkpoint, all those expectations will be run. So that's the folder structure of Great Expectations. So let's go ahead and, as we mentioned earlier, edit this expectation file. So what you can do is you can do grade expectations. I think it's, let's do some help, right? Forget the command. Alright, so you can check this out. So you can say like grade expectations expectation suite, and let's, I think it's edit app dot order dot error, because that was the name of the expectation we had. So if we do that, you will see it's opening a Jupyter notebook where we can go ahead and change the expectation that was initialized automatically by grade expectations library. So let's take a quick look at the code here, right? This is essentially just Python. So it's loading in all these required modules, grade expectations, and Jupyter interaction, setting something called a data context, and then it's defining what type of data source this this batch is made of. So in here, if you see, you'll see the data source is data quality, and the expectation name is app.order.error. So let's go ahead and run that. So you have all these. Okay, so you see this, which is head just gives you the first 10, but we only have 3 rows, so that's why you only see 3 rows here. So this defines the data documentation here. So if you look at this, it says must have between 2 and 3 rows. That's defined as expect table row count to be between 3 and 2. So we don't need any of this, so let's go ahead and I think you can actually delete the cells. Not sure how, but let's do this, right? Let's go ahead and delete this. We don't need any of this. All we need, so let's only keep one test case. So if you press tab, you'll be prompted all these test cases. So let's say column distinct values to be inset. If you press tab twice, you'll be shown the function signature. So you can say like column equal to customer ID, and value set should be the set of values that's allowed. So we currently have customer 1 and customer 2. Let's just say only these 2 customers are allowed, right? So that sounds good. Alright, so let's run this whole thing again. So when you save and review, it's actually going to open the newly generated expectation file. So let's do this. It's running. So if you look at this, okay, it ran. This is fine. Alright, so now you can see there's only one test case, right? So this is our expectation. Now we have edited our expectation. Alright, so now you have one expectation. Similarly, you can have multiple expectations. You can have multiple test cases within a single expectation. But for this example, let's go with one expectation. Now we want to run this expectation. So how do you run this expectation? You put it in a checkpoint. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's stop the Jupyter notebook. So you can type in grade expectations. I think it's checkpoints. Let's see what the comments are. I keep forgetting, so it's very helpful when you do this help. Alright, so you can have list, new, run, script. Alright, so I think it's going to be new. First checkpoint, and let's say app dot so I guess you don't need to say this. All you need to do is checkpoint new and your checkpoint name, and it prompts the table. So let's go with that. Alright, so let's, oh, sorry, not that. Great expectations, checkpoint. So let's look at all the checkpoints that we have. We only have first checkpoint, so let's go ahead and run it and see if it actually works, right? Alright, so you see validation succeeded. So basically what it did is it took our app.order.error expectation and it ran it. That's all checkpoints are. You can group multiple expectations into one checkpoint depending on your use case. It just encapsulates a bunch of expectations into one checkpoint, and it makes it easier for you to mix and match, so to speak. Alright, so now you have seen how to create expectations, how to run them in terms of checkpoints. So what happens when we run a checkpoint? We earlier saw that it can be like it just shows validation succeeded, but where does this result get stored, right? So the answer to that is in the uncommitted section. So what happens is when you run these validations, or when you run these checkpoints, it gets stored in the uncommitted section, and that is because you don't want the results to be committed to your Git repository, and you want to store it locally. But when you're running this in production, you don't really want to be storing your expectation results as a file. What you would want to do is you want to store them in, say, a database. So let's see how we can do that, right? So let's say ls. Okay, so let's take a look at what our checkpoint is first. Let's checkpoint. Let's cat into that first checkpoint YAML file. Alright, so let's see what's happening here. So it's saying validation operator is action list operator, and then let me move this a little bit. There we go. And then it's just showing the batches that are part of this checkpoint. So let's go ahead and figure out what this action list operator is. So if you see here, you'll see a great expectation.yaml file. That's where all the setup configuration is. So if you go into that, you could see where the validation action list is. There we go. So if you look at this validation operators, you have this action list operator under which you have store validation results, store evaluation parameters, update data logs. So these are the actions that happen when this validation operator is run. So when you're running the checkpoint, these are the things that are happening, right? So right now it says store validation result. Okay, so how does it store the validation result? Let's see. Expectation. There we go. So stores are configurable places to store things like expectations, validations, and more, right? So let's go ahead and see where the validation store is. So we saw that store validation result, store evaluation param store. So if you go down, there you go. You could see that the validation store name is validation store. So what's happening is here you're defining the store validation result, and that gets stored defined by this validation store name, which is this validation store, which is basically a file system store backend. So we want to store this in a database. So let's go ahead and edit this file to reflect that. Again, if you want to follow this in block format, I'll leave the link in the description below. You have all the code there as well. So if that's easier, you can follow that. So let's insert it. I actually have it saved here, so I'm just gonna copy paste that. So let's call this validation store validation postgres store, and for class name, let's use validation store and store backend, and again, this is all in the blog, link in the description below if you want to follow along. The main thing is this credentials. So what happens when you say data quality? It actually uses the place where your data quality, data source, credentials are stored, which is actually in the uncommitted section. So for now, that's fine. Let's leave it in the uncommitted section. But when you're running this in production or release, you want to really think about it. Great Expectations has many options available. I will point to that later. So let's continue with this. So what we did was we added a new validation store, and we want to make sure that that's the validation being used, right? So let's go here, and so it's validations postgres store, right? Okay, there we go. Okay, so now we have modified Great Expectation to store the results of your validation, or store the results of your checkpoint in Postgres database and not in uncommitted file. So let's run first checkpoint again. It is skipping this because this is for the validation files. So it says validation succeeded. Let's go ahead and look at the database. Check. So it automatically creates a validation store for you. Okay, this looks ugly. There we go. So if you look at this, you could actually see very minute details about what were the observed value, how many were missing, what was the count, some more details, and so on and so forth, right? So you could actually parse this out if you really want to get more nuanced information. Right. So let's try a case. Actually, I should not have good. Let's try a case where the data validation is actually going to fail. Sorry about that. So let's say, so remember we have specified that over here we can only allow customer 1 and customer 2 in the customer ID column. Let's, for example, say we insert something called customer 10. Why is it not working? Oh, it's because I assigned only 10. So let's say customer 5, right? Let's go this. Let's run the checkpoint again. This time it will fail. So there you go. It says validation fail. And you can actually go back into the database and check that it actually failed. Okay, this looks ugly, so let's... Alright, so you can see the second result over here, right? And if you look at this, you will see success false. So there you go. And you can see the observed value was 1, 2, and 5. We only were supposed to have 1 and 2, but we got 1, 2, and 5, and hence it failed. So that's how you use Great Expectations. Right? So I hope this gives you a good understanding of how to use Great Expectations and all the available options with Great Expectations, and how you can combine multiple expectations into one checkpoint, and how you can combine multiple test cases into one expectation, what data sources are, and what checkpoints are. So that's another important thing to think about, is when not to use such a data quality framework. So if you're just starting out building your data pipeline, simple SQL tests will mostly be sufficient for your use case. And also if you have a very low number of data pipelines with with low complexity, you should really think carefully before starting a data quality framework, because this will actually add a lot more administrative overhead to your work. Having said that, a lot of companies are using machine learning now, so in those cases having a data quality framework is crucial, because machine learning models, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, don't have the human intuition to stop and say, hey, this data looks wrong. So in those cases, data quality checks are extremely important. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you learned something from it. I hope you like it, and if you do, please like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. See you next time.